Okay, hi everyone. It's so nice to see so many of you here. Welcome to the continuation of the Spring 2022 Cooper Union School of Architecture lecture series. I'm Noura Akawi, a faculty member here at the school, and I'm coordinating this year's public lectures. Thanks to everyone who makes this possible, and for tonight in particular, Mauricio Riguera, Stephen Hillier, Jennifer Woodson, Monica Shapiro, and Dean Nadir Teherani, and Associate Dean Haley Weaver. Before we get into tonight's program, I wanted to mention just a couple of things. First, that next week at the same time and the same place, Thursday, February 24th at 6:30, we'll be hearing from Stella Betts about her practice lab in Betts. She's teaching the Option Studio in the 4th year this year, if you haven't met her. Her lecture is titled 13 Ways of Looking, and she'll be joined by Merci Haveledar in conversation. And also to let you know that as you were walking in and as you will be walking out, you would have seen Tao Dufour's photographs of the photograph exhibition in the hallway with part of his recently published book project, Husserl and Spatiality, a phenomenological ethnography of space. In this book, he examines the depth, scopes, and limits of Husserl's phenomenology of space, specifically analyzing corporeity and the lived body, extending to questions of intersubjective, intergenerational, and geohistorical spatial experience, what he calls the environmentality of space. He does this through his ethnographic fieldwork of reuniões, of gatherings that were part of the ritual structure of the Afro-Brazilian religion Candomblé. Please take a moment to see the exhibition, which has been put together by the School of Architecture Archive. So I'm so excited about tonight's lecture by Jack Halberstam. Thank you. And the conversation that will follow by Ivan Munuera and Sanjana Lahiri. I want to start by thanking the three of you wholeheartedly for being here. As part of my coordinating role for the year's public program, I was given the opportunity to curate the series, which spanned across the fall and will continue through the end of the semester, titled Pluriversal, Bewildered, and Otherwise. It opened last semester and is ongoing and is opening tonight with talks by Arturo Escobar and Jack Halberstam, whose work inspired and gave the series its name. So incredibly grateful for both of you. Alongside and in relation to the lectures by Jack and Arturo, we invited architecture collectives, cooperatives, publishers, researchers, and organizers whose work is rooted in social movements for freedom and justice, and who refuse architecture as a tool or service for colonial and capitalist extraction, and who pave paths towards exiting disciplinary and individualized systems, towards thinking and practicing architecture otherwise. We were joined by WAI Architecture Think Tank, Sigil Collective, represented by Khalid Malas and Salim Al-Qadi, African Mobilities, Matipa, Cohabitation Strategies, and Urban Front, represented by Miguel Robles Duran. And this semester we'll be joined later by Adjustments Agency, the Feminist Architecture Collaborative, and AAU Anastas, who will be sharing their work and their practices through local industries, the Wonder Cabinet, and Radio Al-Haram. Finally, as a collaboration with the interdisciplinary seminar series, we'll hear from Leopold Lambert, who is the founder of the Funambulist magazine. It's an immense privilege to be sharing the room with Jack Halberstam and interlocutors Ivan Munuera and Sanjana Lahiri, and all of you in the room and on Zoom. Just really quickly, after Jack's lecture, Ivan and Sanjana will join the panel for conversation before we open it up for conversation with the audience. And for those of you on Zoom, please feel free to type your questions in the chat or let us know if you'd like to voice them directly. That will be possible too. And now I'll introduce the participants, starting with Sanjana and Ivan. Sanjana Lahiri is in her 5th year of study at the Cooper Union School of Architecture. She's co-founder of the Cooper Union Architecture Lobby Chapter and a member of the Cooper Climate Coalition, a student-led group advocating for climate action and climate justice across the institution. She has previously curated the Cooper Student Lecture Series last year, I think. And currently in the thesis studio, she's engaging with New York City's community gardens as simultaneously sites of resistance and tools of the real estate economy. Ivan Munuera is a New York-based scholar, critic, and curator working at the intersection of culture, technology, politics, and bodily practices in the modern period and on the global stage. He's a visiting professor at Bard and Barnard College, Columbia University. His research has been recognized and published widely. And just to mention what happened in the last year alone, his most recent exhibition titled Vulnerable Beings at the Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology in Lisbon. He has also developed the projects Your Restroom is a Battleground for the Restroom Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale and Transfusing at the Shanghai Biennale. This is all from 2021. But if you want to hear or read more about Ivan's work, I can direct you to the event web page. Jack Halberstam is professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University, and is the author of 7 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, and a short book titled Trans Asterix, a quick and quirky account of gender variance. Halberstam's latest book, which came out in 2020 from Duke University Press, is titled Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. And Jack is now finishing a 2nd volume on wildness titled The Wild Beyond, Music, Architecture, and Anarchy. Thank you so much, Jack, for joining us.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Nora. And wow, it's so exotic to be in person, breathing each other's air. Hopefully we won't regret it later. I won't. Okay. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is a very exciting lecture series. I like the terms of it a lot, and I'm trying to think with those terms, pluriverse, bewilderment in particular, and see if we can think together about architecture otherwise. So what I'm going to do is share with you from basically what I consider to be an archive that I'm exploring, that I believe opens onto a really different political project, many different political projects than those that seem obvious in the current day. And so, you know, I started working a while back with the archive of Gordon Matta Clark, and this led me to investigate more thoroughly other 1970s artists who, like Gordon Matta Clark, seemed more interested in unbuilding than in world making. And through that, it's forced me to sort of rethink queer studies, for example, which often casts itself as a world-building project. If you think of the work of Eve Sedgwick and Jose Munoz and others, there's a kind of a sense that what we should be doing is building the world otherwise in the here and now. And I just was really, let's say, sort of shattered by my engagement with Gordon Matta Clark. It changed a lot for me and forced me to use a different vocabulary. And that's the vocabulary that I want to share with you today. What I'm going to do is move back and forth between projects in the 1970s that I believe throw forward a different vocabulary attached to a very different political sensibility. And then I'll show you places in the present where I think it's been taken up, whether or not that person, the person who sort of seems to be working with that legacy, is aware of using that project. I hope I'm going to make some links so that we can see that the vocabulary associated with unbuilding is more suited to this current moment of catastrophe that we live in, right? So in the 60s, even in the 80s, in the 90s, at other periods, people might have thought that another world was possible and might have felt that the best way forward was through a sort of hopeful, optimistic investment in building other worlds. I just don't think we're in that space anymore. And I think it's become very clear that there is no utopian way forward until we figure out how to unmake the current conditions of possibility. And for that, we need examples, and those examples and those practices come out of, for me, the world of art, fiction, and architecture. Okay, so, you know, I'm going to give lots of examples, and you're going to wonder how they even go together. And they may not, but they do share a vocabulary. And at the end of the day, I will argue that they are all what I'm calling unworlding projects. So if we start with this term bewilderment, which is very much a kind of unbuilding term, what is the word bewilderment? In my book, Wild Things, I argued that bewilderment was actually a pretty nifty concept because it holds the category of the wild within it. And while colonial knowledge is, you know, sort of made up of this will to know and therefore a will to conquer that goes along with the knowledge, bewilderment, I showed in that book, is a kind of decolonial force that undoes the weight or the impact of the colonial encounter. And I gave many examples of that in my book. So here tonight, let's think with this term bewilderment a little bit. I'll use it, for example, to describe people who use architectural training to dismantle structures. That's a bewildering enterprise, that you go and you get a degree, as Mata Clark did at Cornell, and you decide that what you're going to do with it is figure out how to take abandoned buildings apart. That is a bewildering use of architecture. And it's the bewilderment that I believe is the legacy of it that we should be working with. But another one, and I'll explore this in a moment, would be utopian fiction that is intent upon destroying worlds. And I will give you examples of exactly that. Utopian fiction that wants to show you how to unmake a world. It could also describe an aesthetic practice of ruination, and I have an example of that. And finally, I'm going to come back around to a topic that is dear to my heart, which is a kind of counterintuitive staging of the trans body as not the place to consolidate gender formations, but to completely take them apart, right? So the trans body is really used in neoliberalism to sort of confirm in many ways both the expansiveness of the gender system that we live in, and at the end of the day, the rightness of the binary. So in order for the term transgender to do its radical work, it has to obliterate the binary. And I'm going to give you a piece of work that I think does that. So that's, you know, that's kind of the frame. Just to start us off with, well, there you go, a little bewilderment. You've had that already, probably. And there's, you know, one of a few images I'll show of Gordon Matta Clark and engaged in this practice that, isn't it interesting, has become so compelling to us now in this era. I mean, there are so many books that have come out on Gordon Matta Clark in the last 5 years alone that we must ask ourselves why this counterintuitive, strange project that lasted, what, 5-6 years at the most in the 1970s, why is it so compelling to us, this image of a man using both his architectural training and a kind of conventional toolkit to meticulously take buildings to the point of collapse? Clearly, this is more than just a kind of conceptual exercise. And this to me is also an anarchitectural project, and you can find many such anarchitectural projects throughout contemporary art. This is by Doris Salcedo, and it's one of the photographs that she made of a hypothetical rift that she wanted to build into the floor of the Tate Modern. And this cracking of the earth, this breaking apart of the earth, and very specifically of the museum, is part of the trajectory for unbuilding. And I think that's very much consistent with what Nora just explained about this series, thinking about architecture otherwise as a kind of counterforce to the way in which architecture has been used within colonialism to build order into different kinds of terrains as a mode of management. Okay, so what if we thought about working with disorder, unbuilding, cracking, breaking, undoing Unworlding. Okay. There he is again. Yeah. So I've said my piece about Gordon Matterclock, but I'm moving forward with this concept of unbuilding. I think much as the way that in the past I used the category of failure in a counterintuitive way to say that what gathers under the heading of failure are pieces of a project that usually aren't articulated together. So under the heading of failure, I was able to place a relationship to animality, an anti-capitalist critique with clear relationships to time and space. And this idea of bewilderment and unbuilding, these kinds of concepts similarly work counterintuitively to break apart the identity structures that seem intuitive to us and often script our activism, but that are actually in the way of us doing the actual work that we would need to do to take this world down. I use unbuilding in this project to underscore critiques of real estate capital. So if you really want to get at the way in which real estate is essential to current forms of power, you do need a concept of unbuilding, because believe me that power at the moment works through building. And you'll notice, for example, that you could be in an institution that says it's run out of money, but they're still building. Okay, they are always building. Building is in many ways one of the most important colonial tools, neo-colonial tools in global capitalism. So unbuilding allows for a critique of real estate capitalism. It allows us to push back on notions of political activism that are only invested in forward momentum. You know, just do it. Let's do it. Let's get on with it. Let's build towards this, and so on. And then finally, unbuilding, I believe, elaborates a queer and a feminist aesthetic and political project that began in the 1970s and that was never oriented towards world building and accommodation, but focused very specifically on tearing things down. And I want to start by just giving you, if you're like, what was that activism and artivism that was interested in smashing patriarchy, for example? And there's the tools, the same tools that Gordon Matterclock was using. Where's my hammer, right? I need to go smash patriarchy. That would not be a slogan today, but it was a slogan that really made sense in the 1970s. So even though 1970s feminism has been passed off as a kind of anodyne, essentialist, women singing songs in the woods type of activity, there was a really violent side to 1970s feminism that we've sort of forgotten. And that's what I would place in this archive of unbuilding. So Born in Flames, just to give you some pieces from this archive, Born in Flames is a 1979 film about what happens when a socialist revolution has already occurred and it hasn't done anything for women and queer people and people of color. And so you have to revolt against the revolution, and Born in Flames is the story of that revolution. But what's amazing is that there are entire scenes of women learning how to shoot. Okay, and at one point, the leader of the women's army goes off to, I think it's somewhere in the Middle East, I think it's in Iran, and does an arms deal and learns how to shoot and how to organize an army, and comes back to the US ready to go. That would be a very, very, what should we say, boundary pushing film nowadays, right? But Born in Flames at the time, it was just like, oh yeah, have you seen that new feminist film? You know, the one where the women are riding around on bicycles, rounding up rapists, and by the way, going out into the desert to shoot guns to figure out how to overturn the government. That was Born in Flames, 1979. And if it was just Born in Flames, you could be forgiven for saying, yeah, well, you know, these little films pop up. Jana Brown says that it's an anarchist film, and what makes it anarchist is that it refused to offer any formula or solution. This is long before Occupy Wall Street. It provokes, it stirs things up and unsettles us. I find that that is a theme running through all of these unbuilding, unworlding projects that I'm going to share with you. But if you were not sure about Born in Flames, I mean, just think about old Valerie Solanas, 1967 already, who was advocating for a society to cut up men, and using the same vocabulary as Gordon Math Clark. Let's make a cut here, a cut there. For her, it's what if we cut out men from the social order? And then she defines what she means by men, and it's not as essentialist as it sounds. And of course, she was ridiculed and by the way, it wasn't simply theoretical. She did take a gun and go and try and shoot Andy Warhol. So it wasn't just like, hey, what do you think? Let's make a film about women shooting guns in the desert. It's also like, give me back my script or I'm going to shoot you. There's an actual violence in the feminism of the time that deserves our attention, okay? This is Louise Fishman, who did a series of angry women paintings, and there's a whole bunch of them like this. But she also took all of her earlier work and cut it into shreds, ripped it, shredded it, and said all of this work is too influenced by male-centric art, so I'm going to completely destroy my own archive. Okay. Finally, this film, which I really want to write a lot more about, rather than just have it as an example. Does anyone know this film, The Question of Silence? A Question of Silence? Anyone? Yeah, you do, Yvonne, because you've heard me talk a little bit about it. But this is a forgotten classic. And by the way, there are a number of these feminist and queer forgotten classics from the 1970s. Times Square is another one, in my opinion. But let me tell you about this film, and you'll see why people tried to bury it. So, and I don't think that Marlene Boris, the director, made any other films, by the way. She probably couldn't get any more funding after this one. So what happens is there are three women, and you're introduced to them in their daily lives, and they are subject to all kinds of what we would call microaggressions from the men in their lives. They're out, that one has to, pick up her husband's dirty clothes, and another one is stymied in her job, and another one is harassed by her boss, and so on. They don't know each other. They are all out in a small town shopping. They all somehow arrive randomly at a clothing shop at the same time. One of them attempts to steal a dress and shoves it in her handbag. A very pretentious shopkeeper approaches her and says, "Madam, I believe you have put a dress in your bag." And she turns around and hits him. The other two women who are in the store join her, and between them, they batter him to death with coat hangers. You can see it wasn't it wasn't box office fare, let's say, right? But it was really a shocking film. It's like Jean Dielman, right, by Chantal Ackerman, where you watch for 2 hours and then suddenly there's a spontaneous murder after 2 hours of potato peeling. You didn't see it coming. It's like that. It's like that. And then the lawyer who's hired to defend the women, instead of wanting to do right by the law, she's won over to their case. And this is the connection to Born in Flames. None of the women explain why they did it. There's no explanation given. There's no motive. There's no rationale. This is not a crime of the heart, which is the usual way in which women's crimes are described. There's no passion. It is cold. It is dispassionate, and it is efficient. They simply beat the man until he's dead, and then they walk out. So at the trial, they're silent, a question of silence. And that silence is the legacy. Okay, why won't they say anything? And it's not just the violence that we have to sit with, it's the refusal to explain. And I'm going to come back around to the silence in a moment. All right, so I hope I've proved my point, right? That when Gordon Matta Clark was busily cutting up buildings, he was in the middle of a cultural explosion in many ways, in which those acts maybe wouldn't have seemed so out of the norm, in the sense that there are films about revolutionary women taking up arms. There are films about women beating a man to death on behalf of kind of smash patriarchy kind of activity. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of anarchist desire to take the world apart. That is the high point of decolonial movements of the 20th century, the 1970s. And that energy is the energy that I think we should be attending to now, precisely because its trajectory was much more radical than the future that we have arrived in. Okay, so if we return to the 70s and we pick up the pieces of these earlier projects and we follow their trajectory, we will end up somewhere else than this moment of accommodation and quietism and so on. All right, so I've got just 3 sections and I'll try to do them somewhat efficiently. I'll start with this category of unworlding. So if you're feeling a little disturbed by the idea of angry radical women, bashing people's brains out and so on, let's think about other kinds of activities that might gather under the heading of unworlding. And I think here, I would want to say that it's not just about smashing things to pieces. Unworlding is also a commitment to finding out what lives in the shadow of destruction and what lives in the wake of destruction. So Anna Singh gives an answer to that exact question in The Mushroom at the End of the World, which is, a really good answer to colonial anthropology. It's the anthropology or ethnography of a mushroom, and not just any mushroom, but a mushroom that grows in the aftermath of destruction. And so Anna Singh talks about the ruin that glares at us with the horror of its abandonment. It's not easy to know how to make a life, much less avert planetary destruction. She doesn't, in what follows, offer us a blueprint for how to make a life, but instead, she tries to explain to us that in these spaces of ruination, abandonment, precarity, many other things thrive, okay? And one of the things that thrives is the Matsutake mushroom. So she follows this mushroom, which grows where a certain kind of tree has failed. And it's often failed, this one tree, because of pollution, because of lack of water, drought, etc. The forest fails. And in the wake of this destroyed and ruined forest, the Matsutake mushroom grows. And so she wants to follow in the wake of destruction and identify what survives. So it's an interesting, it's a kind of utopian project in some ways. She suggests that the Matsutake mushroom, there they are, sort of looks like a language or an alphabet of some kind in this photograph. They are an entity, she says, that shows, quote, a willingness to emerge in blasted landscapes. And I like the way she gives the mushroom a kind of agency, right? It's not just that mushrooms grow. She says the mushroom shows a willingness to emerge in a blasted landscape. And this, in turn, she proposes, allows us to explore the ruin that has become our collective home. Now, the attraction of the Matsutake mushroom for Singh is not just that it can grow where other vegetal life has failed, right? But because it grows, it now enables other things to grow. So one kind of tree has failed, it has grown out of this disaster, and it now coexists with another kind of tree. And so a different order of things springs up in the wake of destruction. She suggests that it facilitates new ecosystems, and it does so collaboratively and cooperatively. And in this way, we can see how the Matsutake mushroom survives and then follow it into what she calls possibilities of coexistence with environmental disturbance. Do you see? So being in relationship to disaster doesn't mean cleaning up the disaster simply. It also means what can happen within the disaster zone, in the shadow of catastrophe. And this is, I think, what I mean, at least in part, by unworlding, finding alternatives, not in formulations of new worlds, altered realities, or repaired lives, but in the blasted landscape itself, which is, after all, where we live now. So what Singh does is she follows the mushroom from the failure of one kind of tree to the flourishing of another, from the forest to the marketplace, from the commodity chain to non-capitalist regimes. And she's able to find in many of the communities that forage for the mushrooms and then take them to market, they're living off the grid. They're not, even though they're selling the mushrooms, they are not necessarily living wholly in capitalist webs of relations. So where the mushrooms have led, people's communities follow. And this is taking very seriously the idea, the unworlding idea, that we need to upset these hierarchies of life within which humans are the directors of everything and animals are, inferior, and vegetal life is just what we trample on underfoot. There's a real effort here to try to eke out knowledge from these other forms of life. All right, but let's come back to the human a little bit. All right. So when trying to explain to myself this idea of unworlding, I thought, well, can science fiction offer us some clues as to what unworlding would look like? And the person I keep coming back to, I mean, I've looked at, obviously I'm reading Octavia Butler and many others. But Ursula Le Guin in her Hainish cycle was really trying to work out what I think I'm calling unworlding. Now, unworlding is not anti-utopian. It's rather a project that understands that utopia is delayed until we figure out how to unmake the world that we are currently in. We can't even begin to think a utopian project from this particular set of circumstances, this organization of reality, this flow of capital admits for no visions of an alternative. Therefore, what our historical mission is to unbuild in order to open to the utopian. And in this way, it's probably what Jameson would call anti-utopian. All right. So I think that I've identified a genre of science fiction that is unworlding, that moves away from the usual mission of science fiction, which is to build new worlds and make them credible and give you either hope or tell you that things could be so much worse that you're lucky that you're living in the present configuration, right? So let's think about unworlding in The Dispossessed. How many people have read The Dispossessed? Not so many. Interesting. All right, well, I'll give you the plot. I just taught it this week. Lucky you. So I'm full of The Dispossessed. It's literally the only utopian novel in which the author experiments with an anarchist society. Okay, most utopian fiction is either the horror of, potential technological domination, or they're kind of socialist engineered fictions. The Dispossessed is about two planets, Urus and Anaris. Urus is like Earth. It's a capitalist planet. It's full of so-called profiteering people. And 200 years ago, a group of anarchists who are sick of this capitalist world left and went to the moon. And so the two planets are each other's moons. One is capitalist and completely committed to wealth and the wealth of the few, the poverty of the many. And then on the anarchist planet, these folks who left and settled Anaris, and as far as I can tell, reading the novel, there was nobody else there, so it's not exactly settler colonialism. They hew to the principles of an anarchist thinker called Odo. And those principles mean that, for example, they develop their own language in which you cannot say the word my. You can't say my mother, you say the mother. You can't say my hat, you say the hat. So all possessives have been drained out of the language. And it's an amazing, amazing novel. And it seems to be a novel, though, that is stuck in this binary form. It's either capitalism or anarchism. So the main character, Shavik, has developed a physics theory of simultaneity, which is of great value to the capitalists on Eris. They believe that they can use it to develop new technology to speak to each other in real time across planetary systems. So he goes to Eris. He's very seduced by the capitalist system. He's seduced by things like eroticism, pleasure, abundance, nice sheets, privacy, having ownership of his own work, and so on. But he's also sickened by what he finds there, and disturbed by complete lack of any concept of sharing, and so on. So what the novel does is it gives us a series of metaphors for thinking outside of the logic of these two planets. One is the wall, and the wall is a kind of symbolic representation of a division between the two worlds, but it's also, it turns out, Shevik says, as an anarchist, his mission is to unbuild walls. So that's one strand of the novel, is about unbuilding, the anarchist principle of unbuilding. The other big metaphor in the book is empty-handedness, and I'll come back to this. Shevik's always going on about how the anarchist has nothing to give, comes with nothing, offers nothing, and expects nothing. And so nothingness is a kind of key term in an anarchist system of value. And then finally, there's a kind of lesson in here about living in the negative space of the novel, and I'll give you an example of that before I move on. At one point, Shevik is trying to communicate with his manservant about the working classes on Eris. And the servant uses a dialect that's distinct. And Shevik is listening to the dialect, listening to this working class speech. And he says, Le Guin says, Shevik had learned to follow it a little. The shift of sound values was consistent once you caught it. But the apocryphations left him groping. Half the words were left out. It was like a code, he thought, as if the Nyati, as they called themselves, did not want to be understood by outsiders. So these absent words, the code that is used by the working class people, form another language in the novel, telling you to look for what is not there as a clue to how you will find your way to this utopia. So that's the empty-handedness, it's the unbuilding the walls, and it's these other languages that speak by leaving things out. So there's a sort of silent, inarticulate, unworlding set of elements in The Dispossessed that we should pay attention to as part of its architectural mission. Okay, in the interest of time, I won't do that one. The one other sci-fi series takes up this mantle of unbuilding, and that is N.K. Jemisin's. This is a contemporary series that I think is following in the path of Ursula Le Guin, N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth series. Has anyone read the Broken Earth series? Okay, so where in the future, the world is constantly shaking, there are earthquakes all the time, and there's a group of people who can quell those quakes, and they're called Argenes. But they are a slave class, and they are sort of managed by a group of guardians. And that group, the Argenes, are in some way, akin to slaves, and therefore likened to Black people. But the novel is interesting because the Argenes gain a kind of power, and there's a crisis moment in the book where one of the Argenes says to her mentor, should we repair the earth? It's being shaken, it's coming apart, it's unbuilding. She says, we have the power. I think we should rebuild the earth. He responds, I don't want you to fix it. I want you to make it worse. So that's this kind of trajectory of intensifying something until the whole edifice comes down. And I won't go into this, but the reading that I offer of N.K. Jemisin's fifth season comes through Afropessimism. And you can see versions of Afropessimism in this idea that these Argenes are going to unbuild the world that holds them captive. So Calvin Warren, for example, in his Ontological Terror that is widely seen as a key text in Afropessimism, says Black freedom would constitute a form of world destruction. So here's where you can see a kind of the political charge of world destruction. All right, so let me come to the architectural piece. And I think in the interest of time, you know the Gordon Matta Clark stuff. I'm not going to say too much about it. I've been working for a while with the work of Alvin Baltrop, who took the photographs of Gordon Matta Clark's Day's End, the cuts that he made into the piers on the west side. Alvin Baltrop took pictures of those cuts, but he also made portraits of gay men cruising in the piers. And my work has been not on the cruising activity simply, but on how vivid the images of collapse are in these photographs. So these are images of gay men cruising in these ruined buildings, making different kinds of worlds as they pass each other and either hook up or move on. But Baltrop is also paying careful attention to these crumpling forms of architecture. And the thing that I want to say about Baltrop's photographs is that they are documenting and even creating a kind of erotics of collapse. Okay, the way in which the good is bent, the ways in which bodies are set against the massive scale of the side of the warehouse, say. The way in which we see the bodies of the men, but through these fallen girders only, tangled metal, girders at odd angles, sloping floors sometimes, and cracks, holes in the edifice, debris, a tilting world of precarity and disintegration. So what I'm asking is whether there's some kind of erotics available to us in this collapsing world where gay men are cruising, where other people are dealing drugs, other people are living, and all of this in an architecture made up of buildings disintegrating around them. Okay, what does that do? To answer, what that does, what are the possibilities, what are the potentialities of looking at collapsed architectures, I want to move to another artist who's almost never read alongside Alvin Baltrop, but should be. And this is the artist Beverly Buchanan. People know Beverly Buchanan's work? Yeah, a little bit. So Beverly Buchanan, at the very same time that Gordon Matta Clark was making his cuts, Alvin Baltrop was taking photographs of the buildings collapsing. Across town, a Black, and I hesitate to say lesbian because Beverly Buchanan didn't call herself a lesbian, but she was mostly partnered with women. A Black artist was busily making pieces of art out of materials she found in demolition sites. And this is work from some of her very early work from her first show in Manhattan in 1972. And these were, on the left is something she just called black wall. And she painted a kind of concrete, tempered concrete that she had tinted black onto paper and put it up, called it black wall. And this is interesting because later on, that mottled material that she's using, she uses to cover boulders. So this becomes a material that is almost like a signature material she's using. She moved to New York from North Carolina in the 70s to go to medical school, decided medical school was not for her, took an art class with Norman Lewis, was completely, absolutely absorbed by her, the possibilities that art presented to her. And off she went and started making work with materials she found in the street, things that other people had abandoned, materials that she salvaged, materials that she found at demolition sites, and so on. These early works she called city ruins. So you can see that they are in conversation very directly with both Matta Clark and Alvin Baltrop. Let's see how she makes sense of her own work here. And this statement is everything in terms of an aesthetics of collapse. So this is what she says in the little catalog essay that's left from this art show. My interest in walls involves the concept of urban walls when they're in various states of decay. Walls as part of a landscape. And this is why I was pressing on walls in The Dispossessed, since that's the through line in that novel. Walls as a part of a landscape. Often when buildings are in a state of demolition, one or two structural pieces and the word for that is frustula, stand out that otherwise never would have been created. This state of demolition presents a new type of artificial structural system piece that by itself, its undemolished state, would not exist. And this is my emphasis. These discards or piles of rubble can be pulled together to form new systems. These new systems are very personal statements to me. They're inspired by urban ruins, but they are created in my own image by me in concrete and painted with dark paint. Deceptively, they appear to be black. One of my dreams to place fragments in tall grass where a house once stood, but where now only chimney bricks remain. I mean, this is an astonishing statement. And the way I understand it is that through demolition, relationships between pieces of mortar and concrete emerge that you could not have created, but that form a new sign system as they enter into relation under the conditions of demolition. Do you see what I mean? Right. So the kinds of sign systems that buildings are generally using are readily readable, legible to us. We see function, we see form, we see aesthetics. She sees the same thing in the demolition. And more than that, she sees that there are certain things that are left standing in the wake of demolition. Think of that mushroom again, okay? That you could not have created, you could not have grown that mushroom. It grew because something else was destroyed. And so there's the correspondence that when something is destroyed, something else appears that you never could have made, okay? And so there's a kind of this randomness. There's also like what remains in a destroyed building. And that's what she's calling the frustula. One or two structural pieces might remain, might stay standing. So what is that structure that is simply made out of what survives? Not a load-bearing wall, not a beam, not a girder, but just the piece of the structure that withstood the demolition. Do you see? Like there's something about that to me, this is a theory. This is an entire theory of architecture and architecture, really, that you actually can't quite get from the Gordon Matta Clark, because we tend to think of his pieces as a whole, whereas she's looking at the fragments of demolition and thinking about them as a sign system that is trying to tell us something I would say about unworlding. Okay, so that's, for me, it kind of brings together this, the walls in dispossession that need to come down, the empty-handedness, that language that the working class man was speaking, that was defined by what it left out. And here it is again. This is a sign system where you have to read both what is there, what remains, and what is not there. The room, for example, the particular division of space that the house mandated, that's gone. And you have to be aware of that in order to read for the potentiality of collapse. Okay, this is the work she's more famous for. This is interesting stuff, and she's using tabby concrete. She creates these amazing boulders, and then she places them in marshlands in Georgia. And for people who are interested, there's a great little book by Amelie Groom called Marsh Ruins that gives a beautiful deep dive into these pieces, and they're in a marshland in Georgia. That's fine. But for me, that is everything. These little frustula and the black paintings that are black walls that are asking us to exercise a different kind of an architectural vision, a vision that I believe can be joined to these other experiments in utopian fiction, violent feminist art, and so on. All right, let me, and because her quotes are so amazing, she describes her boulders, like boulders are not so interesting to me, but what she says about them in this an-architectural vein is super compelling. She says, she describes the boulders as not weak in the sense of an instant falling apart at the seams. Rather, she's making the boulders to eventually crumble. How fast or slow it becomes a ruin is unknown. How long do modern paintings last? I mean, these sort of epigrammatic comments are, to me, they're everything. Like that she's making a boulder and she's making it in a way that it will crumble. She's not making it to last. She's not thinking, how would I create something that would survive in the marshlands? She wants it to disintegrate into the marshland. Okay. All right. Let me end. Okay, so we can have a discussion and see whether any of this makes sense to you. And you can see I'm trying to jam things together. Some of them may or may not work. But I want to end with the cut. And this is actually a student of mine, Linus Borgo, did this remarkable painting this past year, autotomy in the liminal realm. And I just want to end with it as another example of how cutting and taking apart, particularly in relationship to the trans body, is working with the same set of gestural vocabulary that is about creating a cut, taking something apart so that you can uncover a different sign system altogether. So let me tell you about the painting and then we'll see whether that works, okay? So Linus had his first show just recently in LA, and he called the show, It'll Grow Back Like a Starfish. Maybe some people know the reference or not, which is to Anthony and the Johnsons' brilliant song, It'll Grow Back Like a Starfish. I wish we could play it, but time is short. Go home and listen to it. And in the song, it's a beautiful sort of masochistic song about, and the lead singer is a non-binary singer and sings in a very ethereal, sort of ungendered voice. And he's talking about a lover, Mr. Muscle, who beats him. And he likes it. And he says, happy bleedy, happy bruisey at one point is the sort of the byline of the song. And at one point he says, I love this man so much, I would cut off my own finger. And if I did that, maybe it would grow back like a starfish. Okay, so that's our reference point to bodies that are being like taken apart, not on behalf of love simply, but in this sort of masochistic mode of self-sacrifice. The artist himself is the middle figure with the amputated arm. And Linus is somebody who had a traumatic incident, got electrocuted and did lose half of his arm as an art student, luckily not his painting arm. And what's amazing is in the aftermath of this experiment, and as he was transitioning, he does a series of paintings, most of which are based upon Renaissance paintings, usually of the deposition of Christ. And you can see that this is the reference point, Pontormo's vivid depiction of Christ descending from the cross. It's flipped from one side to the other. But what he does is he picks up certain motifs. And one of the motifs is how many hands there are in this photograph. There is the body of Christ, but then there are all of these hands, helping hands. And there's also a kind of void here in the low part of the painting. He's interested in not just what the painting depicts, but the negative space that it opens up. So how does he depict that? Look again, there it is, that negative space. And in it is a little planet. Here's our unworld. There it is, unworlding. Because we're not on it. If it's there, then it's not where we are. It's Earth, but it's apparently not where the scene of the painting is taking place. The painting is called autotomy in the liminal realm, splitting time with a scalpel. Autotomy, for those of you who don't know, I did not, is when an animal gives up a limb, gives up willingly a limb under catastrophic conditions. So like, let's say a wolf has your limb in its mouth. Some animals can just let that limb go. And of course, this is what Linus did in this traumatic event that he went through, but the starfish can do it and an octopus can do it. And the octopus can do it when it's impregnating, when the male octopus is impregnating a female with a very particular reproductive arm. If he chooses, he can self-castrate and leave that limb in the female. I don't know why. Maybe maybe it's just like an added bonus, like you can have this. I don't know. That was fun. Here you go. But again, like that mushroom that is willing to make its life in the glass of pain, this is like an act that shouldn't be agentic, giving up a limb, but in autotomy is agentic. So it's a way of sort of referring to these otherworldly things that are actually possible and that might want to force us to think differently about the trans body, not as something that gets fixed to signify properly in the sign system of bodies that we currently live in, but as a rupture, as a site of cutting, as a place that is demolished and thereby opens up itself to a new sign system. And so let me just end then by saying that the painting and the song that it refers to don't offer healing where there's been trauma, or comfort where there has been pain. Instead, the paintings linger in the place of amputation, wondering whether the severed limb will return and in what form, noticing new glimmers of light in the spaces opened up by a collapsing and cut body. The small planet below the patient speaks to a new understanding of world and unworld. It peeks through the wreckage, a beckoning unworld that promises nothing, offers no totality, and threatens at any moment to fall into the pluriverse. Thanks for listening. Sorry it was long. Watch the wires.
Can I take the mask off? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Well, first of all, many thanks, Jack, for this incredible lecture. I think that, as usual, it's almost like poppers. I mean, it's like suddenly you're like completely lightheaded, and suddenly you don't know where you are, but you like it. So I would like to start precisely with one of the things that you were talking about in different moments of your lecture, and is decay, but decay in itself, because decaying is a material condition that is narrated in terms of performance, the process of decay, the process of collapse, and this material condition doesn't have an intention. Let's say, it doesn't contain a will. It is not a project that has been outlined beforehand, but something that occurs, that is in the very nature of a given building or infrastructure. And this idea, I think that it is extremely important in architecture because it goes against precisely of this idea of the cis heteronormative econo-racist modern architectural project. If the modern project on its architects, from Le Corbusier to Mies, you name them, were based on the triumph of the will, pun intended, in the relationship with Leni Riefenstahl Nazi movies. I mean, if they were invested in the will of an architect or a society to build something new with a specific goal, with an intention, with a will, you propose something absolutely different in that sense, a different political project. And this is something different, that it is not just to observe, it's not to be dropped out, let's say. And here to quote our beloved Valerie Solanas, dropping out is not the answer, fucking up is. So I guess when you are talking about decaying precisely in Beverly Buchanan, in Gordon Matta Clark, in the Alvin Baldrock photographies of the peers, you are also talking about the abandonment of intention, of this modern idea of will. Is it right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of elements of chance and randomness in Beverly Buchanan's summoning of this site of demolition, and also in her willingness to create things that will decay. And then, of course, there are lots of artists who have done just that. Ava Hesse, just as one example, built her sculptures in materials that she knew would decay too. But of course, it's the museum that wants things to last forever, and so Beverly Buchanan's like, how long does a modern painting last? And there are all of these technologies and techniques now to conserve something. This is not about conservation. This is not about intention, it's not about will, and it's not about conservation. It's very much, in the spirit of a kind of intervention that will have an impact that we don't yet know the shape of, literally. And I mean, I think it's a little different with Matta Clark, because when you look at some of those buildings, there seems to be some intention, like the spiral that he crafts into the building in Paris, for example. It's too beautiful and sculpted not to have had some intention to it. But those early works by Buchanan, they really don't. And that statement that she made, I mean, that's the thing that kind of knocked me out about the work. I was really like just sitting with it for so long thinking, what is she doing with these bits and pieces that she gets from the demolition site? Then when she makes this comment about the frustula, I was just like, wow, that's it. It's not just shock per se, it's uncovering sign systems. And you can't do that deliberately. You have to you're engaged in a kind of excavation, and the sign system will emerge. And that's why I began with the Anna Singh, because her ethnography is instructive in, again, randomly sometimes looking for signs of something that has a kind of counterintuitive path through the forest. So we have to learn otherwise. We have to learn to look differently. We're trained to follow cause and effect, to look for certain things, to then create certain impacts, and to move in a certain direction. And this is a really different project.
Yeah, thank you again for the lecture. Some of the things you said at the beginning about unbuilding in relation to capitalism, our current world, made me think of Scott Gilbert's work in relation to queer ecology, and the notion of the individual, like acknowledgement that individuals are not just one thing, but more so multi-species and multi-level organisms. And again, in relation to what you said about the dispossessed and the use of like non-personal pronouns, like what would unbuilding the individual look like, and what does that mean?
Thank you for that. That's kind of why I think I'm trying to shoehorn the dispossessed in here, because, and it's a complicated novel. It's hard to do justice to it. But it is about unbuilding the individual. That is the answer to that question. It's kind of asking you to imagine an anarchist society where nobody can own anything, which is why you can't have a mother, even you can't have a father. And when you lose the possessive from the language, and the language Previc doesn't have possessives within it, you're forced into a different relation to others, in which your well-being is predicated on their well-being. And there is no individual well-being, because if you're doing well, the whole society is failing, you're not doing well. So the unbuilding of the individual, and he keeps saying, Shevik, the most individual person in the book, the most delineated character in the book, keeps saying, my social mission is to unbuild walls. This is 1974. It's right when that's what Gordon Matta Clark is doing, right? Unbuilding walls. He says, my social mission is to unbuild walls. And then when he addresses the crowd at the revolution that erupts on Earth, he says, I don't have anything to give you. I can only reach out my hand, and my hand is as empty as your hand. And when you realize that you have nothing and I have nothing, then we can all be free. Freedom demands the end of possession. And I think that there are lots of collectivities right now that are exactly that, trying to think about how to unbuild the individual. And sometimes we get locked into these stupid fights about identity politics, but I think being generous, the impetus behind some of the better conversations about identity politics are that. Can we unbuild the individual? Because it's almost viral in the way in which the concern for the individual just dominates so many political projects that could otherwise be opened to collective outcomes. But almost, so few political projects do really have a kind of collective outcome in mind. Mostly it's like, this will be good for these people. And that's why I'm going back to the dispossessed, because I don't really know many depictions of a society that are so thoroughly able to decenter the individual. So it's a good question. It kind of allows me to, to say that that's the point of that piece of the paper that I haven't really properly integrated, but it's there precisely to say Shevik, the anarchist, is reaching for an anarchitectural vocabulary in order to explain what it would mean to live outside of the logics and the motivations of capital.
But that also comprises, in a way, other ways also of understanding temporalities.
Yeah.
In a way. I mean, you pointed out precisely that even the queer temporalities very often have been based in the tradition of Sedgwick or Esteban Muñoz on this idea of world making. But the Unworlding proposes something completely different. It rejects even this kind of linear time in the traditions of Ernest Bloch or Walter Benjamin, but something completely different. And here, I think that it's interesting, even the decolonial project, somebody like Silvia Rivera Cusicanti, that is saying precisely that if the past is not really representing us, how are we going to share a future? So we have to reconstruct the past in order even to consider the possibility of a future. So it is not just like in the tradition of Esteban Muñoz, that the utopias or the futurities are going to be queer, but the pasts have to be re-queered in that sense. So I would like to ask you precisely about the temporalities that your project comprises.
Yeah, and that's why I was going. That's I think why I'm going back to the 1970s, because we're very stuck, in this political moment. Who's we? North American people who imagine themselves to at least be interested in radical political projects are stuck by the particular configurations of capital media, social media, that only allow for for alternatives to be pursued as long as they come back around to capital accumulation. And I think it's helpful. I found it helpful to go back to the 1970s in particular. And as I've been sharing some of this work, I keep hearing from other people who are like, yeah, I'm also looking at the 1970s. Michael Hart told me recently he's writing something on the 1970s. Why the 70s? Well, because in North America, at any rate, those social movements of the 60s had sort of reached an arc of disappointment. There was a kind of energy that had run out. but there was also a sense that the state was rotten. And so you see in the 1970s, in the post-war period, in the wake of fascism and Stalinism, there's a kind of turn to anarchy that is very interesting in many, many different projects, from squatting in some cities, thinking differently about public use of space, thinking about sharing economies, cooperative economies, back to the land movement, and among lesbian separatists, for example, radical fairies movement for gay men, but also the 1970s, as I said very briefly, is this high point in a kind of decolonial moment. And there's possibility available in the 1970s. Of course, we know how the story ends. It doesn't play out the way that if you were to teleport back to the 1970s and think what might be in 50 years, I guarantee it wouldn't be this, you know. And so going back to try to excavate from the demolition of the past these other languages and these other codes seems really worthwhile to me. And, you know, Robin Kelly says in Freedom Dreams, he says, we often think about political movements as either successes or failures. And if they're failures, then you just think, oh, well, that didn't go anywhere, you know. But the archive of a movement is as important as whatever its outcome might have been. And that's why this so much of this is archival pieces that I'm trying to imagine in relationship to one another, to see whether there was, what was this world in which Ursula Le Guin wrote about an anarchist who was going to unbuild walls. This guy is sitting in a harness over in the piers, unbuilding the pier. Another guy is taking photographs of all the piers falling down. Feminists are making films of women's armies. You know, this is clearly more than just a zeitgeist. There's a language there that we can no longer read, and that seems worth paying attention to and decoding.
Mm-hmm.
In relation to what you said about, I guess, like knowledge as a tool of conquest or colonialism, I'm going to phrase this as a yes or no question, but it's obviously not. Do you think it is possible to foster like conditions for bewilderment, for failure, and for these acts of, or these conditions of unworlding and unbuilding within institutions, or is that completely?
Yeah, probably, but how interesting is that? You know, you know, I mean, I have so many colleagues who write what I call institutional critique, and I have to say, I just don't want to read it anymore. I mean, I think it is. Nora and I were talking beforehand. It is better to do the undercommons thing, you know, to go with Moten and Harney and sort of steal from the university and then busy yourself elsewhere, because the action is elsewhere. And I think the Invisible Committee in their manifesto now, they say something similar. They say the zombies in the university don't produce knowledge, they just sort of ratify the status quo. The thing about, you know, practicing bewilderment in the context of an institution, I don't think that's the way to go. I think it's a lot of energy to just reform, basically. So I think that the institution is just the base for these other projects. I mean, the last time we met, Ivan and I were doing an event in a museum in Lisbon, and you know, not being in a university and not simply being in a museum space with curators, it does open up other kinds of conversations. So I think we should be doing that work. I can't. I just find, I mean, if we were really to pursue an anarchist move here, we would deinstitutionalize knowledge, medicine, law, all of it. And I think that is the ultimate goal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think we both have a lot of questions, but maybe you can open it.
Thank you so much for what has been one of the most articulate presentations we've heard in years. I want to
I'm worried for you.
I wanted to follow up on Sanjana's because, well, because
Yeah, okay.
we are stuck with that. And the way that you position language is so important in the way that you build the case. And the idea of unmaking in many ways has so much to do with another metaphor that we use quite commonly, especially in this group, and that is unlearning.
Yeah.
Where the way that you build your case is makes reference to the actual unbuilding of things. So it's quite physical. It is, architecture is not a metaphor. It is the thing itself.
Right.
But I read in your presentation also the ideological dismantling of the very institution that makes those things. So at one level, maybe I'm just reiterating what Sanjana is asking. The first portion of the question is, how do you unlearn when you are in a framework of an institution that is precisely about building? And I'm talking about the architectural. The second part of that question, I just got out a couple of days ago on a jury with Anne Lacaton of Lacaton Vassal, whose Pritzker Award is basically rooted in the principle of refusing to demolish, which in a world that is fundamentally unsustainable, her will, if you will, is about refusing to demolish buildings of the 20th century and only adding on to them. And therein lies a kind of redemption. I'm asking, this is a question, it's not a comment. That she poses the possibility of redemption in refusing to build, but allowing amplification on the ruins of the 20th century. And I'm trying to see whether in the context of unworlding, there are possibilities or cracks of these kinds of practices that are wholly institutional at the end, and yet they do not belong in the rubrics of the real estate construct that I believe you were referring to. But I'm trying to see if there's any spaces of redemption in this.
Probably not. But I don't think I understand why does she refuse to demolish, to hold on to something, or?
No, it really has to do with embodied energy. The idea that so much of construction is wasteful, and the carbon emissions that is involved in construction is really what is dismantling the world. And there is a political will to say that we will refuse to build new buildings. And also, it's a killing.
Refusing to build,
It's also the killing of the author of, this is my new building, look at me, this is the willful building. That it is always a parasite onto the existing world. So it is the mushroom itself.
So it's both though. It's like, no, I'm not going to build a new building. I'm not going to demolish this one, and I'm not going to build a new one. I mean, and that's absolutely part of what I'm pointing to. Like, we live in a world where we're told that we have a terrible homeless problem, but we don't. What we have is a terrible building problem, right? Because we have hundreds of buildings that people don't live in, but they're investment properties, and we have lots of people who can't afford any longer to live in urban environments. So the way in which we approach these issues is all wrong. That's why I'm saying, yes, we have to unlearn this language. There's no homeless problem. There is a problem of people having too many homes, and there's a problem of people having too large a home, and there's a problem of people building impractical homes that suck up all the energy. But the problem is posed always at the poverty end of the scale, right? So I think that we're saying similar things, but in a kind of decolonial context, I also think that unbuilding has a kind of charge to it. I mean, if you think about like settlements in an Israeli context, for example, settling and is building. is exactly a kind of colonial occupation. And so this notion of unbuilding, like to unbuild your presence somewhere, is, I hope, can be heard, I hope, as a decolonial project. It is meant as a decolonial project. It appears as such in Dispossessed. It absolutely functions in that way in Beverly Buchanan's work, not simply decolonial, but also about racialization and urban poverty as well. And these demolition sites, the left as supposedly eyesores that have to be replaced with luxury buildings and so on. All of these dynamics of building, occupying, demolishing, it seems to me that there's both a global capitalist project embedded in all of that, and there's also the possibility of its undoing. And that's what I'm trying to attend to. You know, it's not like this is going to emerge with a solution or something. But yes, some institutions can play a role in this in the sense that institutions are holding frames for capital ideas, for people with visions. They're not only, you know, sort of money laundering entities. So I'm not trying to be flip about institutions. I get what you're saying. There are ways in which we can make interventions from them. I just think that the project of taking apart the institution is in and of itself not particularly radical. Yeah.
A related question that refers perhaps more to the discipline of architecture.
Yeah.
Is that sure, you know, architecture has for at least 500 years had a fascination with ruins.
Yeah.
And the manner of co-opting or even promoting ruins in order to create images of various sorts, which they use not necessarily to the end that you're suggesting, but in fact to quite different ones. Obviously, Piranesi, Rudel Romero's images of the ruins museum as a way, in fact, of claiming a project for a museum. John Soane creating the Bank of England, for goodness sake, as a ruin in order to speak to architecture. James Sterling knocking a few blocks out of projects in order to redesign. So how does your project avoid the aestheticization in the negative sense of rendering consumable images of the ruin in a way that essentially defangs them of the energies that you see? And just to push back a moment on Matta Clark, at least as Matta Clark is understood in architecture schools and art schools, it was a highly aestheticized project. And that wonderful first photograph you showed shows precisely the balance of cutting away, but never so much as to make the thing actually collapse.
Exactly.
It would collapse with it.
Right.
And
To
so
the point of
there's-
collapse, right?
So I thank you for the lecture. I'm really fascinated by many of the things you brought up, but I'm really concerned and interested in terms of the discipline of architecture with this problematic relationship to the aestheticization, the fetishization of ruins, and all of the other uses to which that imagery and that reality is put. Just to add one other reference to the frame, there are any number of cities in Germany in which the fragments of existing cathedrals have been lovingly not rebuilt, not consolidated, but kept as precisely the kind of object that Beverly
Buchanan.
Thank you. Buchanan's suggestion creates. Those are the products, obviously, of firebombing of the war and the rest. And there is both a nostalgia and a kind of, again, aestheticization of beauty of ruins. It seems to me precariously balanced with what you're suggesting.
That's a really good point. And one that this project has to manage and has to answer to. And one answer is, what kind of history does the ruined object refer to? Under what circumstances can a ruin evoke nostalgia? And under what circumstances does a ruin evoke horror? And so Beverly Buchanan made it clear that many of her objects were designed to be ruins of ruins. And the reference was where she placed those boulders, the marsh ruins, was off from a little island where Black slaves had jumped overboard from a ship rather than come to land and be enslaved and put on a plantation. And she wants her boulders to be like tombstones, to monuments, if you like, of remembrance for slave bodies in the area of Georgia and also in North Carolina, where she did some work, where there are no monuments to slavery. And she made these boulders that look like old graves that have been moved out of a graveyard and placed somewhere else. And so on the one hand, yes, they could be easily slotted into the sort of the nostalgia for the patinaed ruin that speaks of an earlier moment and a simpler world and so on, or else it's a marker of a history that has been obliterated from the national record. And that's really different from the cathedral in Germany that is, the fragment of which is held onto in the same way that little pieces of fascism are maintained in people's psychic lives and homes and so on. So I think there's a historical difference, which is why I am saying this is a feminist project, and this is, this Black queer photographer was taking pictures. And the piers, of course, were not ruins. They were not ruins. They were just 10 years on from post-industrialization. But in his photographs, we don't see ruins. But what we do see is just the remarkable shapes and geometries of collapse. So in that instance, it's not at all about a ruin. It's about the way in which, humans are marking terrain differently in that space, but also the way in which the architecture itself is reassembling into some other purpose, the purpose of cruising, that nothing in that world was set up to enable cruising. And yet here is this collapsing framework within which cruising takes place. So I think it is quite different. I think there's a social framework within which these pieces signify, and I think that there's a historical trajectory that marks them differently. I don't know if that's enough, but I'll think about it.
Also, well, and there's also another question, but also one of the interesting aspects in that sense, for example, with the piers, is that they were not so much preserved also as a kind of a monument that you have to look at.
Yeah.
But one of the things is that they were unpoliced. And
Exactly. There were no police there, right?
And it was extremely important precisely for certain communities that actually were thriving in the piers.
Yeah.
But then suddenly, I want to, there is a question here.
So in discussing queerness, I think like an important sort of piece that I was talking about is just like queerness sort of takes for granted this like opposition of like the heteronormative.
Yeah.
Not to say that the queer body didn't exist before we had language to define heteronormativity, but that in this like where we are at now in this moment, it's sort of a cultural phenomenon that exists in tandem, kind of depends on the opposite. And
right.
In discussing like unbuilding worlds, if queerness is something that in the like Western modern mind is often seen as this opposite, this binary, opposing the hetero, then like in unbuilding the hetero, what happens to the queer? And like what and I guess also in line with that question is like what are the limits of the destruction? So like at what point and then I had another question. I don't know if this is like can be sewn into the other two, but like is healing and sort of unbuilding, are those mutually exclusive? Because when we were discussing this painting, it's like this is an elemental space, but this is also just like this chaos, this like losing the limb, that's part of the healing process. And that's more of like an interpersonal feeling that I'm discussing, but yeah.
Yeah. What happens to the queer if you've unbuilt the heteronormative? Well, the Marxist fantasy is that things wither away, that you get rid of the tension and the dominant force withers away. And you then don't need to put all of your social energy into opposition, and it can go somewhere else. And I mean, really, what is queer at this point, other than a kind of brand? And I think that's why I'm saying, in relationship to this question about the individual, it's a really important question. How do you unbuild the individual? Because it's the individualization of these kinds of projects that turns them into consumer products and into, you know, a kind of neoliberal program. So we don't really need the queer. If you read The Dispossessed, there isn't queerness, but there also isn't homosexuality and heterosexuality. You partner with whoever you feel like partnering with. You don't own people. You don't pair in monogamous relations. And Shevik has a relationship with a man, even though he's mostly heterosexual, but because it helped his social bond, you know, and he's not phobically opposed to homosexuality, even though it's not his preference, because it hasn't been socially constructed as something that is, you know, unthinkable if you're this kind of person. So part of it is that we can't imagine outside of these binaries. You know, this is why this painting is so mind-blowing to me, because taking a scalpel to the binary in a way is to enter into what Nora has called the pluriverse, because there wouldn't be queer and heteronormative. There would be sexuality, and its purpose wouldn't simply be, say, individual pleasure or reproduction. It might be, as in The Dispossessed, the social bond, the strengthening of the social bond, the deepening of a relationship with someone, for example. Oh, we decided to partner because we were such good friends, you know. So there are so many other ways that relations could go than the current configuration of social relations. And the reason I wanted to go there was to say this isn't only about structures. This is actually about intimate relations and social relations, and the fact that they could also be otherwise, right? Healing. Yes, this is a photograph about care, or a painting about care, isn't it? He's held so lovingly by every single person in the painting. It's about, you know, the corresponding painting is about sacrifice and transubstantiation, you know, moving from being in the human realm to being in a kind of spiritual realm. But I feel the need to push back on repair and the reparative, precisely because it seals something over that, with Beverly Buchanan staring into the void of the demolition space, I want to keep open. And notice that the wound is not healed here. It is deliberately blood tipped, the arm. You know, I found that piece of the painting very moving. You know, the fact that he left his own arm there still bleeding. You know, so there's an exposure, and the fact that his ass is literally hanging out. You know, we're being asked to look and not be comforted. Because I think when we're comforted and comfortable, some of the more jagged edges, you know, aren't doing their work. Yeah.
More questions?
I have a question from, they can't hear me through the microphone. Maybe could you help me call them?
Yeah.
Oh, can you call on whoever's in Zoom to see?
No, just through the mic. If there's somebody on Zoom who would like to ask a question, you've identified yourself, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the amazing presentation. I was wondering if you would like to talk a little bit more about the ethical component of unbuilding. So is there a sense of maybe empathy that could come from, or is informed by, the aesthetics of collapse? Thank you.
Empathy. Before you disappear back into the Mike, can you say a little bit more? Why empathy?
I'm thinking about these like looming unworlding, which is coming from climate collapse. So in a way, there can be a sort of understanding or connection with these kind of aesthetics that could give us a sort of clue of, you know, as architects, our role as compulsive builders would have to change for a more empathic connection, so I'm kind of connecting empathy with the aesthetics of collapse. I know it's a bit much maybe, but your work has been informing our thinking. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if it's ethical. I think what we're both talking about is something more political, that there's a politics of unbuilding and a politics of not building. And what looks often like a kind of rational or a financial decision to build something is in fact part of a colonial inscription of space. And therefore the decision to withdraw from the scene of building, or even to take down, it seems to me, you know, is a different kind of political motivation. And it's a withdrawal. And I'm not sure I would use the term empathy here either. Something about the word empathy isn't, it's confusing me. Even though I see that you're asking me whether this could be part of some kind of environmental justice project. And I think in its most basic form, it can be, in the sense that we're all talking critically about real estate capital. But I think there's also something that's just trying to be a bit more suggestive here, and suggesting in implying that we don't necessarily know what this political trajectory will look like, that it unfolds as we cease to do certain things.
Also in a way, because, and also to relate it to the previous question in that sense, maybe because it's not so much about sometimes empathy or healing, but about collective caring. Because I think that, for example, in both in the Linus Borgo, for example, painting, I'm not sure that it is so much sometimes about this healing, but about this caring and the recognition of something is going on. And maybe we don't have the answer, but we collectively care. Or even in the scene that you were describing about in question of silence, that they care in a way, and the way that they are showing it is from a very specific form of participation, that it is silence, and that is extremely violent, precisely because of you know, the need always of explaining or giving a reason that is impossible in that language that it is very much based on a certain structure.
Yeah, I like that, Ivan. There's the kind of the collectivity, everyone holding the body here. And in fact, all of the orderlies and nurses and doctors are based upon his friends. He had his friends pose to make the photograph from which the painting is drawn. So I think there is something in here about trying to make a shift, a scalar shift, to thinking in collective terms rather than individual. And sometimes the language of caring has a kind of individualist force to it, or a Christian force, or the language of repair suggests that it's the broken piece that is the problem, not the method of the repair, right? So we're trying to be better. In a sense, we're trying to sit with brokenness here, and as this painting is, and reveal the brokenness in order for there to be other possibilities of seeing, which is why I'm, you know, when I saw the painting, I looked at it for a long time before I saw that earth. I was just like, then I was like, what is that? You know, but also notice the blood. I mean, it's like being at Bellevue or something. There's still blood on the floor. We have to be cleaned up, you know. So it isn't notice that it isn't a scene of sterile enclosure by any means. Because of this arrangement of bodies, and it's so important that the trans body is central, this broken trans body is central to it, another space opens up. And it's, in a way, you know, to go back to the question about temporality, we're trying to think about different chains of interaction that open differently onto possibility and potentiality.
I'm thinking about, yes, I'm building in the world sometimes rolling with that, seeing what concept, but also like, for example, in this painting, I'm seeing a lot of beauty. And right away, I'm thinking like there's an institution behind, this care is paid for, or maybe I'm paid for, I don't know. So there's always the, let's say, the specter of the institution behind these things. And in it, I'm reading, I'm going back to your comment about Fred Moulton and then the undercommon. Here, the undercommon is the earth, in a way, as it's hiding beneath this painting. But I guess back to this idea of empathy or a guiding kind of like, there is a desire almost in trying to understand on building to make it be a positive thing.
Yeah, right.
Somehow make it like, oh, please tell me a good story. And in a way, I think it, you know, you're telling us it's not about that.
Right.
It's about something bigger. Like there's something to the sharp edge that we need at the moment. But still, I'm going to ask you, everyone here, what's a guiding sense? What's something that can take us through that jagged edge?
Yeah. Thank you, Mauricio. It's well put that we want something good at the end. You know, it's like we want somebody to be healed. We want something to have happened. And, you know, I think that that's a failure of mine in a sense that I often am dealing in negative materials like failure, for example, and then I try to turn it into something that can give something back. And that's not necessarily helpful here. And that's why I'm trying to exactly that, to resist the neatness of saying, and therefore, if we unbuild everything, the world will be a better place. You know, there's a sense here of of sitting with the discomfort, I guess, and you know, recognizing that discomfort is partly a perspective. I don't know. I'm not gonna be able to answer that. Yeah. Last question.
Yes. In that relation to care and the projects of problematic art, I always find interesting that after this famous cut, he was also doing another art project that is not presented as such usually. This was the roasted pig parties.
The food parties.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he was not in the restaurant that he had in Soho, but also the coming together and like having a public manifestation and gathering and connection with people. As a byproduct or as a parallel view along that side of dismantling and bringing it down.
Right.
And so this is like the thought that I had, but I want to ask like a similar question to the one the architecture and the ruination and aestheticization of collapse and ruin, but on a very different project, and that of accelerationism. And the idea that within that side of collapse, we will let it happen even more, which I understand that is opposite to what you were proposing.
Right.
It's not dismantling what is, but accelerating. But I would like you to talk a little bit about that.
Well, let me just start, because with the Gordon Matta Clark piece to say, you know, that this can join to the Moten and Harney material by saying that what's important, for example, is not just to take apart an institution, but to deinstitutionalize certain kinds of activities like conviviality, that you can have conviviality by simply saying, we have food, we would like to share it, come by, you know, like, do you want to eat? Here's some food. Not, let's all meet at a restaurant and then all give our credit cards at the end, you know, deinstitutionalizing certain kinds of activities, like the painting. Yes, it seems as if there's an institution where he's looking in the background, but in fact, the blood is on the floor. You know, these gowns are actually kind of beautiful. They're in colors that are not just kind of scrub colors. They're extravagant to their function. And this is a kind of healing that is outside of the institutional regulation of the hospital, suggesting that healing is something that can only come from people gathering together in a non-institutionalized way. So I think all of this material is about pulling people out of their institutional relationships, unbuilding those sequences in order for different kinds of communion and community to happen. I think that there's probably an unfortunate parallel to the accelerationists here, and I even was worried about that while I was putting some of the materials together. But I think that there's also their argument for speeding up of everything so that you come to the point of crisis. And many of the people whose work I'm discussing would say crisis is already here. We're not speeding up something to arrive at a crisis. In many, many places in the world, in many of the communities that the people are working out of, like Beverly Buchanan, who after this point had a whole series of health crises that stopped her from working, who, you know, as a poor Black woman had a very hard time supporting her artwork and so on. The crisis it's not some future thing that we need to speed up on. It's already here, and it's here and distributed through the very institutional networks that we're wondering whether we can repurpose. So I think that's a big difference. Yeah.
I wanted to relate it to another thought that I was having in relation to a couple of things. One is a conversation that was led by Erica Hunt, where with Sadia Hartman and Jerome Ellis, where it was about it was called Looking for Language in Ruins.
Mm-hmm. And
it was her presentation was specifically titled The Performance of Hope in the Face of Catastrophe. And then she specifically about this point, she was basically stating the world has actually already come to an end.
Yeah.
For those who have
exactly
made to face that, and yet they have survived.
Yeah.
Even if barely. And I think it makes me think of the work of artists like Basil Abbas and Ruwan Abrahim, who work specifically in the context of Palestine in a very different kind of ruin.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with Adrian Rich's poem,
Diving
into the Wreck.
Yeah.
And they focus on the notion of settler colonialism never being a complete project.
Yeah.
And their notion, I guess, if we were to connect it to unworlding, would be an unworlding, an unbuilding of the image of the world as settler colonialism puts it. And of course, it's from within the discomfort of working in the ruin that settler colonialism has left your own village, your own town, your own homes in the state of. And so going into the ruin of their own towns, finding those ingredients of the settler colonial project, and I don't know what making their work
intensifying. Yeah.
And so it's a different kind of ruin that they're working with, but they're unworlding.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the point about unworlding, to remake, unmake, undo this particular script about world. within which people are forced to play their role. Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to get the names of those guys from you. Yeah. Thank you all so much. This has been really helpful to me. Thank you. I